I had my phone out before it even happened. That is the thing I keep coming back to. My wife and I had been standing at the forecourt railing for almost 40 minutes, trying to get a clear shot of the palace gates before the state motorcade arrived. The light was good, that sharp, mid-morning gray that makes the stone look like iron, and the guard at the center post was worth photographing on his own. He had not moved in the entire time we were there. Not a twitch. His red tunic was perfect, his bearskin centered exactly, his white-gloved hands wrapped around the rifle barrel in that locked, ceremonial grip. He stood so still that a pigeon had landed on the gilded lamp standard 2 feet from his face, and he had not even tracked it with his eyes. I remember saying to my wife that he looked less like a man on duty than like part of the gate itself, and she said, quietly, that the still ones are always the ones you should never test. I laughed at that. Within the hour, I would learn she was exactly right. I was filming him when the lead vehicles of the foreign delegation's advance party came through the outer arch. There were 4 of them, dark, heavy cars with diplomatic plates, not the official motorcade but the security detail that always runs ahead. They came in faster than I expected, and they stopped in a loose cluster just inside the forecourt entrance, partly blocking the pedestrian lane where we were standing. A man got out of the second vehicle almost before it had fully stopped. He was compact, broad-shouldered, wearing a dark suit with a security credential on a lanyard, and he moved like someone who had spent a long career making other people move out of his way. I found out later he was the visiting minister's security chief. At the time, I just thought, this man is irritated about something. He walked straight to the guard, not to a supervisor, not to the duty officer in the booth to the left, not to the palace liaison officer who was standing 30 feet away near the ceremonial entrance. He walked to the guard at the center post and stopped about 2 feet in front of him. My camera was already running. He said something. I could not hear it over the general noise of the forecourt, but I could read the body language clearly enough. He was pointing at the pedestrian lane, then at the guard, then making a small, sharp gesture toward the side that said, without any ambiguity, "Move, get out of the way." The guard did not move. He looked straight ahead over the man's shoulder at the middle distance, that trained, 100-yard stare that looks like it could go right through a wall. The security chief said something else. His jaw was tight. His hand came up, and he made the same gesture again, slower this time, as if the guard simply had not understood him. The guard stood exactly as he had been standing for the past 40 minutes. I saw the moment the security chief decided he had had enough. He turned half away, said something sharp to one of his subordinates, then turned back. And then he put his hand on the guard's shoulder and shoved. Not a tap, not a firm press. A shove, two-handed into the guard's left side, hard enough to rock him a half step off his mark. The bearskin dipped. The guard's right boot scraped the cobblestone and found it again. I heard the sound the crowd made. It was not a gasp, exactly. It was more like a sudden collective intake, the sound of several dozen people all registering the same wrong at once. A woman beside me said something under her breath in a language I did not know, and it did not need translating. The guard recovered his footing in less than a second. He brought himself back to center. He set his rifle. His eyes went back to the middle distance. He did not look at the man who had shoved him. He did not say a word. If anything, his posture was more precisely correct than it had been before. Shoulders squared, chin level, absolutely still. The security chief stared at him for a moment, apparently genuinely surprised that the shove had not produced any visible reaction. He said something else, low, close, clearly, an instruction or a demand, and when nothing happened, he reached out and took the guard's arm. That was when the palace liaison officer arrived. He had been walking toward them since the shove, and he stepped in with the quiet, absolute authority of someone who has dealt with this exact kind of situation at least 100 times and has no emotional investment in it whatsoever. He placed himself between the security chief and the guard, said something short, and held up one hand. The security chief began explaining himself loudly in a language I did not speak, and the liaison officer listened without any change of expression, then said something else, equally short. The security chief's voice went up in volume. The liaison officer took 2 steps back, turned slightly away, and made a call. It lasted approximately 90 seconds. I kept filming because I did not know what else to do. My wife had grabbed my arm at some point during the shove and had not let go. Around us, maybe 40 or 50 tourists had their phones up. A few people had moved back from the railing to get a wider angle. Nobody left. The security chief's subordinates had gotten out of the cars now and were standing in a loose group near the lead vehicle, watching, though none of them moved toward the guard or the liaison officer. The guard never moved. Not once through any of it. His eyes were forward. His hands were on the rifle. He was the stillest thing in the entire forecourt. The liaison officer ended his call, put his phone away, smoothed the front of his jacket, and waited. He did not look at the security chief. He did not look at the guard. He stood at an angle to both and studied the middle distance, which struck me as a skill not unlike the guard's own. 4 minutes, roughly. That is about how long it took. The first vehicle came through the outer arch at a pace that was not quite normal, deliberate, unhurried, but carrying a kind of weight that made people step back from the railing without really deciding to. It was a long, dark car flying the household standard from a short mast on the bonnet, and behind it came 2 more like it, and then a police outrider, and then a 4th car. They did not stop at the outer arch. They came all the way into the forecourt and arranged themselves in a quiet, efficient arc across the entrance lane, blocking every exit except the one that led back into the palace. Out of the 3rd car came a colonel. I could see the rank from where I was standing, in full dress uniform. He was followed by 2 officers and a man in civilian clothes, who walked like he had been moving through the corridors of this building since before the security chief was born. The colonel did not hurry. He walked to the liaison officer, exchanged 3 or 4 words, then walked to the security chief. Whatever the colonel said was brief. The security chief started to answer, and the colonel spoke again, still quiet, and the security chief stopped. I watched his face. The contempt that had been on it a few minutes earlier was gone. In its place was something more careful. One of the civilian officials, the one who moved like he owned the building, produced a document of some kind and handed it to the security chief. The security chief looked at it for a moment. Then he looked at the guard, who was still standing at his post, still facing forward, still entirely unmoved. Then he looked back at the colonel. There was a brief conversation between the security chief and someone on his own team, conducted quietly, without the earlier volume. After that, the security chief's vehicles were directed by an outrider into a holding area near the north wall, away from the pedestrian lane. The security chief himself was escorted, politely, through a side entrance into the palace. His subordinates followed. The whole thing was handled so cleanly that if you had arrived in the forecourt 30 seconds later, you would not have known anything had happened at all. Except for the guard, he stayed exactly where he had been through all of it. The convoy, the colonel, the document, the quiet exit, none of it changed his posture or his expression by a single degree. When the colonel passed on his way back to the vehicles, he paused at the guard's post for a moment and said something quietly. The guard's only response was the faintest straightening of his spine, a microscopic acknowledgement that fell just inside the boundary of ceremony, without breaking it. Then the colonel left, the convoy dispersed, and the forecourt went back to being a forecourt. I have thought about what I filmed that morning a great many times since. Not the shove, though I think about that too. What I keep coming back to is what happened in the 4 minutes between the liaison officer's phone call and the convoy's arrival. The guard stood at his post through a loud argument conducted in his immediate vicinity, through a physical confrontation, through the arrival of multiple vehicles and a colonel and a document he was never shown, and he did not move, did not speak, did not turn his head. He was the only person in that entire forecourt who behaved exactly the same at the end as at the beginning. I think that is what the institution was saying, actually, when it sent the convoy and the colonel and the document. It was not primarily a message to the security chief. It was a confirmation. The man at the post had been correct. The man at the post had always been correct. Everything that followed, the cars, the rank, the quiet escort through the side entrance, was simply the building standing behind what one guard already knew. The motorcade arrived 22 minutes later, the full official state ceremony, flags, outriders, the formal procession in through the gates. The guard was still at his post when it came through, standing exactly where he had been standing all morning. The pigeon had come back to the lamp standard. He did not look at it. My wife asked me later that evening if I thought the guard even knew what had happened behind him, the colonel, the document, the whole quiet machinery of consequence. I said I thought he knew. I thought he had always known, with absolute certainty, that if he held the line would hold behind him. That is not arrogance. That is what it means to trust the institution you serve as completely as it trusts you. He held the post. Everything else, as they say, followed.